David couldn't stop thinking about that lake. For 3 weeks, he'd find himself staring at those photos on his laptop after Tommy went to bed. The dark water, the tall pine trees, the mountains in the background. It looked like a different world. From their cramped apartment in Cleveland, Tommy kept asking about it too. Every few days, he'd bring it up casually. "Dad, what do you think the fish in our lake look like?" Or, "I bet there are cool rocks around a lake in Montana." The kid had started checking out library books about Montana wildlife and geology. David would find him reading about grizzly bears and mountain formations with the same focus other kids put into video games. The decision came on a particularly bad day. David's truck had started making a grinding noise that meant expensive repairs. He couldn't afford. Tommy had an asthma attack at school and had to use the nurse's emergency inhaler because he'd forgotten his at home. The electric bill arrived with a disconnect notice, and to top it all off, David's boss told him they were cutting back hours due to a slowdown in new construction projects. That evening, while Tommy was doing homework at their little kitchen table, David made a choice that probably wasn't smart but felt right. "Hey, buddy, what if we took a road trip to see that property in Montana?" Tommy looked up from his math worksheet, his eyes wide. "Really? We could actually go there?" "Just to look," David said quickly. "We can't keep it, but maybe we should see what Uncle Harold left us before the county takes it away." David had done the math. Gas would cost about $300 round trip. They could sleep in the truck or find a cheap campground. He had 5 vacation days saved up that he'd been holding on to for emergencies. Maybe this counted as an emergency of the heart. Tommy was so excited he could barely sit still. That night, David heard him on the phone with his friend Carlos, telling him about the adventure they were going to take. "We're going to see our lake," Tommy said, and David's chest tightened. Their lake, even though they'd probably lose it in a few weeks. They left on a Thursday morning in late April. David had packed everything they might need into his old pickup: sleeping bags, a cooler with sandwiches and snacks, Tommy's inhaler and backup medications, a first aid kit, and the metal detector Tommy had gotten for Christmas 2 years ago. That metal detector had been David's attempt to give Tommy something fun to do that didn't cost ongoing money. It came from a garage sale, cost $15, and barely worked, half the time. But Tommy loved it. He'd take it to parks and beaches, finding mostly bottle caps and lost coins. The most valuable thing he'd ever found was a silver ring worth maybe $10, which he'd given to David for Father's Day. The drive to Montana was the longest trip they'd ever taken together. David had never been west of Illinois. As they drove through Iowa, Nebraska, and Wyoming, both father and son watched the landscape change from farmland to plains to mountains. Tommy had his nose pressed to the window most of the time, pointing out things he'd only seen in books. "Dad, look at those mountains. They're so much bigger than I thought they'd be." David had to agree. Pictures didn't capture how massive the Rocky Mountains actually were. They made Cleveland's modest skyline look like toys in comparison. They stopped at roadside diners where the waitresses called them honey, and the coffee was stronger than anything David had ever tasted. They bought postcards at gas stations and slept one night at a rest stop under more stars than Tommy had ever seen. "Is this what it's like where our lake is?" Tommy asked, lying in his sleeping bag in the truck bed, staring up at the night sky. "I think so," David said. "Maybe even better." They reached Billings, Montana on Saturday afternoon. The lawyer had given David directions to the property, but also warned him that the last few miles were on dirt roads that might be rough after the spring snowmelt. David's old truck had handled the highway fine, but he was nervous about what they'd find on those back roads. The turnoff from the main road was easy to miss, just a wooden post with a number and an arrow pointing into the forest. The dirt road was rutted and rocky, exactly as advertised. David's truck bounced and shook. As they climbed into the mountains, pine trees closing in on both sides. "This is like being in a movie," Tommy said, gripping his seatbelt as they hit a particularly big bump. After 30 minutes of slow, careful driving, they reached a clearing. And there it was, Uncle Harold's cabin. It was smaller than it looked. In the photos, with a sagging front porch and windows that needed cleaning. But it had character, like something a person could call home if they didn't mind being far from everything. Tommy was out of the truck before David had even turned off the engine. The boy stood in the clearing, slowly turning in a circle, taking it all in. The silence was incredible. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just wind in the pine trees and birds calling to each other. "Dad, where's the lake?" Tommy asked. David checked the lawyer's directions. According to the map, Willow Pond was about a quarter-mile through the trees behind the cabin. They grabbed the metal detector and started walking down what might have once been a path, but was now mostly overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. When they broke through the tree line, both father and son stopped dead in their tracks. The lake was beautiful. Not just pretty, but genuinely beautiful in a way that made David understand why people wrote poems about nature. The water was dark and still, perfectly reflecting the mountains and sky. Pine trees came right down to the water's edge on most sides, and there was a small sandy beach area where they were standing. "Dad, this is ours?" Tommy whispered. "For now," David said. "For today, anyway." Tommy ran to the water's edge and knelt down, cupping the clear water in his hands. "It's so clean! And look at these rocks!" David had to admit the rocks were unusual. Most lakes he'd seen had regular pebbles and sand, but Willow Pond's shoreline was covered with smooth, round stones that seemed to come in every color. Some were almost perfectly spherical, like marbles that had been tumbled by the water for years. Tommy was already walking along the shore, collecting interesting specimens and dropping them into his backpack. "Dad, these are so cool. I've never seen rocks like this." David found himself relaxing for the first time in months. The afternoon sun was warm, the air was clean, and Tommy was happy. Really, genuinely happy in a way that David hadn't seen since before the divorce. His son wasn't. Thinking about asthma attacks or medical bills or the fact that they'd have to give this place up. He was just being a 12-year-old boy exploring nature. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the lake. Tommy found a beaver dam, tracks from deer in the mud, and more interesting rocks than he could carry. David found something he'd almost forgotten existed: peace. For a few hours, he wasn't worried about money or bills or whether he was doing right by his son. He was just a dad watching his kid be amazed by the world. As the sun started getting lower, they made camp in the clearing near the cabin. David managed to get a fire going with wood that Uncle Harold had apparently left stacked under a tarp. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, and Tommy told his dad about every rock he'd collected, explaining the different colors and textures like a young geologist. "Dad, can I try the metal detector tomorrow? Maybe there's buried treasure around here." David smiled. "Sure, buddy, but don't get your hopes up. That old thing barely works, and I doubt Uncle Harold buried any pirate gold." But Tommy was already making plans. "I want to check around the lakeshore first. All those smooth rocks had to come from somewhere, right? Maybe there's something interesting buried underneath." That night, lying in their sleeping bags under a canopy of stars brighter than anything they'd ever seen in Ohio, David made a decision. Even if they couldn't keep this place, even if they'd have to go back to their small apartment and their small life, this trip was worth every penny it cost. Tommy deserved to have memories like this. He deserved to know what it felt like to have space to explore and discover things. "Dad?" Tommy's voice was quiet in the darkness. "Yeah?" "This is the best place I've ever been." David looked up at the stars and made a silent promise to his son. Somehow, some way, he was going to figure out how to give Tommy more adventures like this. The lake might not be theirs to keep, but the memories would belong to them forever. What David didn't know was that his son's curiosity and that $15 metal detector were about to change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. Sunday morning came with the sound of birds David had never heard before. He woke up in his sleeping bag feeling more rested than he had in months, despite sleeping on the ground. The air was crisp and clean, and when he looked over at Tommy's sleeping bag, his son was already awake, staring up at the sky with a huge grin. "Dad, I can still see some stars even though it's getting light. That's so cool." David stretched and checked his watch. 6:30 in the morning. Back home, they'd both be sleeping until at least 8 on a Sunday. But here, surrounded by nature, they both felt energized and ready to explore. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee from David's thermos, Tommy was practically bouncing with excitement to start treasure hunting. He'd laid out all his rock specimens from the day before in careful rows, organizing them by color and size like a young scientist. "Look, Dad, I found at least 12 different types yesterday. And these round ones are really weird. I've never seen lake rocks that are so perfectly smooth and heavy." David had to admit, some of Tommy's finds were unusual. The round stones in particular seemed too perfect, like they'd been shaped by something other than water and time. But then again, David was a construction worker, not a geologist. Maybe all mountain lakes had rocks like this. Tommy strapped on his backpack, grabbed the old metal detector, and headed toward the lake with the determination of a professional treasure hunter. David followed, carrying a small shovel they'd brought along and enjoying watching his son's enthusiasm. "Okay, so I read that metal detectors work better in the morning because there's less interference," Tommy explained, adjusting the sensitivity dial on their $15 garage sale find. "And shorelines are the best places to search because stuff gets washed up by the water." The metal detector immediately started beeping as soon as Tommy turned it on near the water's edge. But that wasn't unusual. It always did that until Tommy adjusted the settings. What was unusual was that it kept beeping even after he'd calibrated it properly. "That's weird," Tommy muttered, moving the detector head back and forth. "It's like there's metal everywhere." For the first hour, they found the usual suspects: old bottle caps, a rusty fishing hook, some aluminum can pieces that had probably been there for years. Tommy didn't seem discouraged. If anything, each small find made him more excited about the possibility of discovering something bigger. David found himself getting caught up in his son's excitement. There was something addictive about the beeping sound and the anticipation of what might be buried just under the surface. They worked their way slowly around the lake's perimeter, with Tommy carefully scanning every foot of shoreline. Around 9 o'clock, they reached the far side of the lake where a large pine tree had fallen into the water, probably during some long-ago storm. Half the tree was still on land, creating a little peninsula that jutted out into the lake. The spot looked like it had been collecting debris for years. "This looks promising," Tommy said, adjusting his backpack straps. All kinds of stuff could get caught around that fallen tree. The metal detector went crazy as soon as Tommy got near the fallen pine. The beeping was so constant it almost sounded like one long tone. Tommy looked confused and started adjusting the sensitivity settings again. "Dad, something's wrong with the detector. It's acting like there's a huge piece of metal buried right here." David knelt down and looked at the area Tommy was scanning. It just looked like muddy shoreline to him, covered with the same smooth stones they'd been seeing everywhere. But the metal detector was definitely picking up something significant. "Maybe there's an old car or something buried under all this mud," David suggested. "People dump all kinds of stuff in remote lakes." Tommy shook his head. "The signal's too spread out for a car. It's like there's metal scattered all through the mud here." They started digging carefully, using the small shovel in their hands. The mud was thick and cold, but not too deep. About 6 inches down, Tommy's fingers hit something hard. "Got something." He pulled up what looked like just another smooth stone, about the size of a golf ball. But when he placed it in David's palm, David was surprised by how heavy it felt. "That's really heavy for such a small rock," David said, turning it over in his hand. "Are you sure this isn't metal?" Tommy took the stone back and looked at it carefully. It was dark gray, almost black, and had that same perfect smoothness as the other round stones he'd been collecting. But this one had a subtle shine to it that was different from regular rocks. "The metal detector is still going crazy," Tommy said, waving it over the area where they'd found the stone. "There's definitely more stuff down there." They kept digging, and over the next 2 hours they pulled up dozens of similar stones. All roughly the same size, all perfectly smooth, all surprisingly heavy. Tommy filled his entire backpack with them, and they still seemed to be finding more with every shovelful of mud. David was starting to feel puzzled. He'd worked construction for 15 years and had a pretty good sense of what different materials looked like and felt like. These stones didn't feel like any rock he'd ever handled. They were too heavy, and they had an almost metallic quality to them despite looking like stone. Around noon, they took a break for lunch. Tommy spread out his morning's finds on a flat rock, arranging them in neat rows like he had with his collection from the day before. In the bright sunlight, some of the stones had an unmistakable shimmer to them. "Dad, do you think these could be valuable?" Tommy asked, holding one up to catch the light. David didn't want to get his son's hopes up. "I don't know, buddy. They're definitely unusual, but I'm not sure unusual means valuable. People find interesting rocks all the time." But privately, David was wondering the same thing. He'd never seen anything quite like these stones. They were too uniform, too heavy, and too perfectly shaped to be ordinary lake rocks, and the way the metal detector had gone crazy around them suggested they contained some kind of metal. They were just finishing their sandwiches when they heard a voice calling from across the lake. "Hello over there. Everything okay?" David and Tommy looked up to see an older man waving at them from the other side of the water. He appeared to be camping, with a small tent set up in a clearing between the trees. The man started walking around the lake toward them, and David could see he was probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from spending a lot of time outdoors. "Hope you don't mind me coming over," the man said as he got closer. "I'm camping here for a few days, and I don't see many other people in this area. Name's Professor Johnson, but everyone just calls me Doc." David stood up and shook the man's hand. "I'm David, and this is my son Tommy. We're checking out some property that was left to us." Doc nodded toward Tommy's collection of stones. "Looks like the young man's been doing some serious rock hunting. Mind if I take a look at what you found?" Tommy beamed with pride and started showing off his specimens, explaining where he'd found each type and what made them interesting. Doc listened patiently, asking good questions and clearly taking Tommy seriously. But when Tommy showed him the heavy, round stones from the morning's dig, Doc's expression changed completely. He picked up one of the stones, hefted it in his palm, and held it up to the light. His eyebrows went up, and he looked at Tommy with surprise. "Son, where exactly did you find these?" Tommy pointed toward the fallen tree. "Over there by that big pine that fell in the water. The metal detector went crazy in that spot, and we dug up a whole bunch of them." Doc walked over to examine the area where they'd been digging, still holding one of Tommy's stones. He knelt down, looked at the muddy shoreline carefully, and then came back with a very serious expression on his face. "David, can I ask you something? Have you had these stones tested by anyone?" David felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. "Tested? No, we just found them this morning." "Why?" Doc held up the stone again, turning it in the sunlight. "I retired from teaching geology at Montana State University 5 years ago. I've been studying rocks and minerals for 40 years, and I've never seen anything quite like these." Tommy's eyes went wide. "What do you think they are?" Doc paused, like he was trying to decide how much to say. "Well, I could be wrong, but these stones are much too heavy to be ordinary lake rocks. And this shimmer they have in the sunlight? That suggests they might contain some kind of metal deposits." David's heart started beating faster. "What kind of metal deposits?" "The kind that mining companies spend millions of dollars looking for," Doc said quietly. "Son, I think you might want to have these analyzed by a professional laboratory as soon as possible." Tommy looked at his dad with excitement and confusion. "Dad, Does this mean our rocks might be worth money? David stared at the pile of stones. His 12-year-old son had dug up with a $15 metal detector. They were sitting on property he couldn't afford to keep, in the middle of nowhere, having stumbled across something that might actually be valuable. For the first time since Uncle Harold's lawyer had called, David started to wonder if maybe their luck was finally about to change. The drive back to Ohio felt completely different from their trip out to Montana. Tommy sat in the passenger seat with a shoebox full of his mysterious stones, carefully wrapped in old t-shirts so they wouldn't bang against each other. Every few miles, he'd unwrap one and hold it up to the window, watching how the light played across its surface. Dad, what if Doc is right? What if these are really valuable? David kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, buddy. We need to find out what they actually are first. But inside, David was fighting a battle between hope and fear. Hope that maybe, just maybe, their luck was finally changing. Fear that this was just another disappointment waiting to happen. He'd learned not to get his hopes up about anything, especially when it came to money. Doc had given them the name of a geology lab at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, not far from their apartment. He'd also written down some notes about what tests to ask for, though David didn't understand most of the technical terms. Words like spectral analysis and rare earth element content sounded expensive. Back home in their small apartment, the Montana adventure felt almost like a dream. But the shoebox of stones on their kitchen table was real enough. Tommy had arranged them in careful rows again, organizing them by size and the intensity of their metallic shimmer. We need to find out how much it costs to test these, David told Tommy on Monday morning before leaving for work. And we need to figure out fast, because we've only got 3 weeks before we lose the property. David spent his lunch break at the construction site calling the university. The woman who answered the phone in the geology department sounded busy and a little impatient. Testing for rare earth elements? That's pretty specialized. Dr. Chen handles that kind of analysis, but she's booked up for weeks. David's heart sank. Weeks? I'm sorry, but this is kind of urgent. Is there any way she could fit us in sooner? Hold on. The woman put him on hold for what felt like forever. When she came back, she sounded slightly more interested. Dr. Chen says if you can bring the samples in tomorrow morning, she might be able to squeeze in a basic analysis, but it's going to cost $200. $200. David looked at his wallet, knowing he had maybe $60 in cash and a checking account that was running dangerously low, but this was too important to pass up. I'll be there, he said. That evening, David did something he hadn't done since Tommy was little. He called his sister Rosa in Chicago. Rosa was 3 years older, worked as a nurse, and had always been the responsible one in the family. She was also the only person David knew who might be able to lend him money without asking too many questions. David? Is everything okay? You never call unless something's wrong. I need to ask you a favor, Rosa, and I know how this is going to sound, but I need to borrow $200. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Rosa knew about David's financial struggles, and she'd helped him out before when Tommy had medical emergencies. But David tried not to ask unless it was absolutely necessary. What's going on? Rosa asked. David told her the whole story. The inheritance, the trip to Montana, Tommy's discovery at the lake. He could hear Rosa's skepticism growing with every detail. David, honey, you took your son on a road trip you couldn't afford to look at property you can't keep. And now you want to spend money. You don't have testing rocks? I know how it sounds, David said. But Rosa, you should see these stones. They're not normal, and this geology professor we met thinks they might be valuable. David, please, just this once. If the tests show they're worthless, I'll never ask again. But if there's even a chance they're worth something, I have to know. For Tommy's sake. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. Okay, but I want to see the test results. And if these rocks turn out to be worthless, you're going to stop chasing impossible dreams and focus on getting your life back on track. David felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. Thank you, Rosa. I'll pay you back, I promise. I know you will. The next morning, David called in sick to work and drove Tommy to Case Western Reserve University. The geology building looked impressive and intimidating, full of smart people doing important scientific work. David felt out of place in his work boots and worn jeans, carrying a shoebox full of rocks. Dr. Chen turned out to be a small, energetic woman in her 50s who seemed genuinely interested in Tommy's find. She examined the stones under a magnifying glass, weighed them on a precise scale, and asked detailed questions about exactly where they'd been found. "These are definitely unusual," she said, holding one of the larger specimens up to the light. "The density is much higher than typical lake stones, and this metallic luster suggests significant mineral content." Tommy was practically vibrating with excitement. "What kind of minerals?" "That's what we're going to find out," Dr. Chen said with a smile. "I'll run a full spectral analysis and check for rare earth elements. Can you come back Thursday afternoon for the results?" Thursday felt like the longest day of David's life. He kept checking his phone, wondering if Dr. Chen might call early with results. Tommy was just as anxious, constantly asking if it was time to go to the university yet. When they finally sat down in Dr. Chen's office Thursday afternoon, she had a stack of printouts and a very serious expression on her face. "Tommy, your rocks are quite remarkable," she began. "They're not actually rocks at all. They're what we call rare earth nodules, formed by a very specific geological process that concentrates valuable metals into these rounded formations." David felt his heart stop. "Valuable?" Dr. Chen nodded. "Your samples contain significant concentrations of neodymium, dysprosium, and several other rare earth elements. These metals are essential for manufacturing everything from wind turbines to electric car batteries to smartphones." Tommy's eyes were huge. "How much are they worth?" "Well, that depends on several factors," Dr. Chen said carefully. "The market price for these elements fluctuates, but currently, neodymium is worth about $40 per pound, and dysprosium can be worth up to $300 per pound." David tried to do the math in his head. Tommy's shoebox contained maybe 20 pounds of stones. If they were worth even a fraction of what Dr. Chen was suggesting. But here's the really important question, Dr. Chen continued. "If these nodules are scattered around the surface of your lake, there's a good chance there are more deposits in the lake bed itself, potentially much larger deposits." "What do you mean?" David asked. Dr. Chen pulled up a geological map on her computer. "Rare earth deposits like this usually form in specific geological conditions. If there are surface nodules, it often indicates a much larger deposit underneath. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars worth of minerals." The room seemed to spin around David. Millions of dollars. The property he couldn't afford to keep might contain millions of dollars worth of valuable metals. "How would we find out for sure?" he asked. "You'd need a proper geological survey," Dr. Chen explained. "Ground-penetrating radar, soil sampling, core drilling. It's expensive, probably $20,000 to $30,000 for a thorough survey." David's brief moment of excitement crashed back to reality. $20,000 to $30,000. He didn't have $200 without borrowing from his sister. "But," Dr. Chen added, "if I were you, I'd find a way to do that survey. Based on what I'm seeing in these samples, there's a very real possibility you're sitting on one of the most significant rare earth deposits discovered in the United States in the last decade." Tommy looked at his dad with wide eyes. "Dad, does this mean we can keep the lake?" David stared at the test results, his mind reeling. They had 3 weeks to pay $15,000 in taxes or lose the property forever. But to prove the property was valuable enough to justify keeping, they needed to spend $30,000 they didn't have on geological surveys. It was the most impossible situation David had ever faced. They might be sitting on a fortune, But they needed money to prove it existed. And they needed to prove it existed to get the money to keep it. Dr. Chen, David said slowly, if these test results showed up in the right hands, would mining companies be interested in this property? Dr. Chen nodded. Absolutely. The U.S. imports almost all of its rare earth elements from China. American mining companies are desperately looking for domestic sources. A deposit like this would be incredibly valuable to the right company. David looked at Tommy, who was still staring at the rocks that had changed from interesting specimens to potential treasure. What do we do now, Dad? David didn't have an answer. But for the first time since Uncle Harold's lawyer had called, he started to think that maybe, just maybe, they might have a fighting chance. David stared at the ceiling of his apartment at 3 in the morning, his mind racing. 2 weeks left, 14 days to come up with $15,000, or they'd lose the property forever. The irony was crushing. They might be sitting on millions of dollars worth of rare earth metals, but they couldn't afford to keep the land long enough to prove it. Tommy had been asking the same question every day since they got Dr. Chen's test results. Dad, what are we going to do? And every day, David had to say he didn't know. But lying there in the dark, David started thinking about something Dr. Chen had said. Mining companies were desperate for domestic rare earth sources. What if he could get their attention before the county auction? What if the test results were enough to interest someone? The next morning, while Tommy was at school, David did something that scared him more than any decision he'd ever made. He called in sick to work again, which meant losing another day's pay he couldn't afford, and spent the day at the library, researching mining companies. He found 3 companies that specialized in rare earth mining and had operations in Montana. Using the library's computer, he sent emails to all 3, attaching Dr. Chen's test results and photos of Tommy's rock collection. His message was simple. My son discovered rare earth deposits on property I inherited in Montana. Professional. Testing confirms significant concentrations of valuable metals. Property will be auctioned by county in 13 days for unpaid taxes. Interested parties, please contact immediately. David knew it was a long shot. Big mining companies probably got emails from crazy people claiming to have valuable rocks all the time, but it was the only idea he had. Meanwhile, he started exploring every other option he could think of. He called banks about loans, but his credit score and income made him unqualifiable for anything close to $15,000. He looked into hard money lenders, but their interest rates were so high they'd bury him in debt even if the property turned out to be worthless. On Wednesday, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Denver, Colorado. Is this David Rodriguez? The voice was professional, confident. This is Janet Walsh from Rocky Mountain Minerals. I received your email about rare earth deposits. David's heart started pounding. Yes, that's me. Mr. Rodriguez, I have to tell you, we get a lot of calls from people who think they've found valuable minerals. But your test results from Case Western are very interesting. Where exactly is this property located? David gave her the details, trying to keep his voice steady. Janet asked technical questions about the geology of the area, the size of the property, and the specifics of Tommy's discoveries. She seemed to know what she was talking about. Mr. Rodriguez, based on what you've told me, I'd like to send our field geologist out to take a look at your property. Would that be possible? How soon? David asked. Because we've only got 10 days before the county takes it for unpaid taxes. There was a pause. That's very tight timing. But if your deposit is as significant as these test results suggest, it might be worth our while to move quickly. Can you meet our geologist there this weekend? David's hands were shaking as he hung up. A real mining company was interested. They were sending a real geologist. But even if the geologist confirmed everything, would there be enough time to work out a deal before the auction? That evening, David sat Tommy down for a serious conversation. Buddy, I need to be honest with you about our situation. We might lose the lake even if it turns out to be valuable. We're running out of time. Tommy nodded solemnly. At 12 years old, he'd learned to understand when his dad was worried about money. But the mining company is going to look at it, right? Yeah. But even if they want it, business deals like this take time. More time than we have. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then looked at his dad with determination. Dad, what if we borrowed the tax money? Just enough to keep the property until we know for sure. David had been thinking the same thing, but the numbers were impossible. Tommy, $15,000 is more money than I make in 6 months. Nobody's going to lend that to someone like me. But that night, David found himself back at the computer, looking into every possible source of money. Personal loans, credit card cash advances, payday lenders. Everything came with interest rates that would destroy him financially, but maybe that was better than losing the property entirely. By Thursday morning, David had made a decision that probably qualified as the biggest gamble of his life. He was going to piece together the $15,000 from every source he could find, no matter how risky. First, he called his sister Rosa back. I need to ask you something else, and I know you're going to think I've lost my mind. David, what now? The mining company is sending a geologist this weekend. If he confirms what we think, this could change everything for me and Tommy. But I need the tax money now, or we lose it all. How much are we talking about? David took a deep breath. 15,000. The silence on Rosa's end lasted so long that David thought she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke. David, I don't have $15,000 just sitting around. I know, but you've got good credit. Could you get a personal loan? I'll sign whatever papers you want. If this doesn't work out, I'll pay every penny back, even if it takes me years. And if you can't pay it back, then you can hate me forever. But at least we'll have tried. Rosa was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice was soft. David, you're asking me to risk my financial security on rocks your 12-year-old found with a garage sale metal detector. I know how crazy it sounds. But Rosa, what if Tommy really did find something amazing? What if this is our one chance to change our lives? I can't live with myself if I don't try. Friday morning, Rosa called back. I got approved for a $10,000 personal loan, and I'm taking $5,000 out of my retirement account. David, this is everything. If you're wrong about this. David felt tears in his eyes. Thank you, Rosa. I swear I'll make this right. But $15,000 wasn't enough. David still needed to come up with the rest. That afternoon, he did something that made his stomach sick. He went to one of those payday loan places that charged 50% interest. The woman behind the bulletproof glass looked at his pay stubs and shook her head. I can do $3,000, but you'll owe us $4,500 in 2 weeks. David signed the papers anyway. He got another $2,000 as a cash advance on his credit card, maxing it out completely. That left him just short of his goal. But his friend Mike from work stepped up with a loan of $500. By Friday evening, David had exactly $15,000 in cash and debt that would take him years to pay off if the mining deal fell through. He'd basically bet everything on Tommy's rocks and a geology report from a company he'd never heard of a week ago. Saturday morning, David and Tommy made the drive back to Montana. This time, Tommy was quiet, sensing the weight of what was happening. They'd stopped at the county office on the way out of town to pay the tax bill, and David's hands had literally shaken as he'd counted out the cash. Dad, are you scared? Tommy asked as they drove through Wyoming. David looked at his son in the rearview mirror. Terrified. But Tommy, sometimes you have to take big risks for big rewards, and sometimes you have to believe that 12-year-old boys with cheap metal detectors can find treasures that change everything. The mining company's geologist was supposed to meet them at the property Sunday morning. Dr. Patricia Barnes, Janet had said. 20 years of experience finding valuable deposits all over the world. As they set up camp by the lake Saturday night, David realized that by this time tomorrow, they'd know whether he'd just made the smartest decision of his life or destroyed his family's financial future. Tommy sat by their campfire, holding one of his original rock specimens and turning it over in his hands. "Dad, whatever happens, I'm glad we tried." David looked at his son and realized that win or lose, Tommy was. Right? Some chances are worth taking even when you can't afford to take them. Sunday morning came with gray skies and a light rain that made everything feel uncertain. David woke up in his sleeping bag with his stomach in knots. Today would either vindicate the biggest gamble of his life or confirm that he'd just buried his family in debt for nothing. Tommy was already awake, sitting by the dying campfire and staring out at the lake. The boy had been unusually quiet since they'd arrived, seeming to understand the weight of what was about to happen. "What time is the geologist supposed to get here?" Tommy asked. David checked his phone. 10 o'clock. She should be here in about an hour. They made coffee and ate granola bars in silence, both too nervous to have much appetite. David kept checking his phone for messages, worried that Dr. Barnes might cancel at the last minute. At 9:45, they heard the sound of a vehicle. Coming up the rough dirt road, Dr. Patricia Barnes turned out to be a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the kind of practical clothes that suggested she spent most of her time outdoors. She stepped out of a white pickup truck loaded with equipment and introduced herself with a firm handshake. "So you're the father-son team that's got my company interested?" she said with a slight smile. "I have to say, your email was unusual. We don't usually get mineral reports from 12-year-old treasure hunters." Tommy stepped forward confidently. "Would you like to see where I found the rocks?" Dr. Barnes nodded approvingly. "I like your enthusiasm, young man. Show me everything." For the next 2 hours, Tommy led Dr. Barnes around the lake like a professional tour guide. He showed her the exact spot where he'd made his discovery, explained how the metal detector had behaved, and presented his carefully organized collection of specimens. Dr. Barnes asked detailed questions and took notes on a waterproof tablet. She used equipment David had never seen before, devices that could analyze rock composition on the spot, tools that measured magnetic fields, and a ground-penetrating radar unit that looked like something from a science fiction movie. "Tommy, your discovery site is very interesting," Dr. Barnes said as she studied readings from her equipment. "The nodules you found are definitely rare earth concentrations, and the subsurface scans suggest there's much more material below ground." David felt his heart rate increase. "How much more?" Dr. Barnes pointed to her tablet, which showed a colorful map of the lake bottom. "See these red and orange areas? Those indicate dense concentrations of heavy materials. If I'm reading this correctly, your lake is sitting on top of a rare earth deposit that extends about 40 feet down and covers roughly 6 acres of the lake bed." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Is that good?" Dr. Barnes laughed. "Son, that's very good. Based on what I'm seeing here and assuming the concentrations are consistent with your surface samples, we could be looking at one of the largest rare earth deposits discovered in North America in the past decade." David felt dizzy. "What does that mean in terms of value?" "Conservative estimate. $4 to $5 million worth of extractable rare earth elements. Possibly more if market prices continue to rise." The number hit David like a physical blow. $5 million. He'd been struggling to pay a $15,000 tax bill, and they'd been sitting on $5 million. Dr. Barnes continued, "Of course, extraction is expensive and complicated. We'd need to do environmental impact studies, get mining permits, set up processing equipment. The whole process would take at least 2 years. "But you're interested?" David asked. "Very interested. Interested enough that I'm going to recommend my company make you an offer." That afternoon, Dr. Barnes made several phone calls to her office in Denver, while David and Tommy waited anxiously by the lake. Finally, she approached them with a formal-looking document. "David, my company would like to propose a partnership. We'll handle all the costs of extraction and environmental compliance. In return, we'd like to offer you a 30% share of all profits from the mining operation." David stared at the contract. 30% of millions of dollars, even After taxes and expenses, it would be more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. There's also a signing bonus, Dr. Barnes added. $100,000 paid immediately upon contract execution. Consider it a good faith payment while we get the mining operation set up. $100,000, immediate payment. David could pay back Rosa, clear the payday loans, and still have money left over for Tommy's college fund and their own financial security. What's the catch? David asked. Because there had to be one. Dr. Barnes smiled. No catch. We need domestic, rare earth sources, and you need mining expertise. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. The only condition is that you agree to environmental protections for the surrounding forest and wildlife habitat. David looked at Tommy, who nodded enthusiastically. Dad, this means we can keep the lake forever. 3 months later, David stood in the yard of their new house, a modest 3-bedroom place just outside Billings, Montana, with a view of mountains and enough space for Tommy to have his own geology lab in the basement. The boy had become something of a local celebrity, featured in newspaper articles about the kid who discovered treasure with a garage sale metal detector. The mining operation was proceeding slowly and carefully, with environmental scientists monitoring every step to ensure the lake and surrounding ecosystem remained healthy. Dr. Barnes had kept her word about environmental protection, and the mining activities were restricted to a small section of the lake bed, using techniques that would restore the area when extraction was complete. David had quit his construction job and taken a position as community liaison for the mining project, helping coordinate with local residents and environmental groups. It wasn't the kind of work he'd ever imagined doing, but he found he enjoyed being part of something bigger than himself. Tommy was thriving in his new school, where his geology knowledge made him popular with both teachers and classmates. He'd started a geology club and regularly led field trips to interesting rock formations in the area. The boy still carried that first rare earth nodule in his backpack, his lucky rock, he called it. The signing bonus had taken care of all their immediate financial problems. David had paid back Rosa with interest, cleared all his debts, and even managed to buy a reliable truck that didn't have a permanently lit check engine light. For the first time in years, he slept well at night, but the real treasure wasn't the money. It was watching Tommy discover his passion and seeing his son's confidence grow as he realized that curiosity and persistence could literally move mountains, or at least uncover what was hidden beneath lakes. Local newspapers had picked up Tommy's story, and it had spread across social media with headlines like 12-year-old's metal detector discovery changes family's life. The attention had been overwhelming at first, but it had also brought opportunities. Tommy had been invited to speak at science fairs and geology conferences, inspiring other kids to explore the natural world around them. 6 months after the contract signing, David and Tommy returned to Willow Pond for the first time since the mining equipment had arrived. The lake still looked beautiful, though now there were scientists in waders taking water samples and a small floating platform where core drilling was taking place. Tommy stood on the same shoreline where he'd made his discovery, now wearing a hard hat and safety vest as an official junior consultant to the mining operation. Dad, do you think Uncle Harold knew about the rare earth deposits when he left us this place? David had wondered the same thing. I don't know, buddy. Maybe he just knew it was a special place and wanted to make sure it stayed in the family. Tommy picked up a regular lake stone, just an ordinary rock this time, and skipped it across the water. I'm glad we took the chance. David watched his son, no longer the worried kid from their cramped Cleveland apartment, but a confident young man who'd learned that sometimes the biggest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places. Me too, Tommy. Me too. As they drove away from the lake that evening, heading home to their new life in Montana, David realized that Uncle Harold's gift hadn't really been the property. It had been the chance to discover what they were capable of when they stopped being afraid to take risks and started believing in possibilities. The useless lake had taught them the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes what looks like a burden is actually a blessing in disguise, and sometimes 12-year-old boys with garage sale metal detectors really can find treasures that change everything. David Rodriguez never thought his life could get any worse. At 34, he was working double shifts at a construction company in Cleveland, Ohio, just to keep the lights on. His apartment was small, the walls were thin, and the heating barely worked during winter. But it was home for him and his 12-year-old son, Tommy. The divorce had been rough, really rough. David's ex-wife had decided she wanted a fresh start in California with her new boyfriend, leaving David with full custody of Tommy. At first, David thought he'd won something precious. Tommy was his whole world, after all. But reality hit fast when the bills started piling up. Tommy had severe asthma, the kind that sent them rushing to the emergency room at least once a month. Each hospital visit meant another stack of medical bills that David couldn't afford. His insurance covered some of it, but there were always co-pays, deductibles, and treatments that somehow didn't qualify for coverage. David had started keeping a shoebox full of unpaid medical bills under his bed, too scared to add them up. Every morning, David would wake up at 5 in the morning, make Tommy breakfast, check that his inhaler was in his backpack, and drop him off at school before heading to the construction site. Every evening, he'd pick up Tommy, help with homework, make dinner from whatever was cheap at the grocery store, and fall asleep on the couch watching TV because he was too exhausted to make it to his bedroom. Money was always tight. David shopped at thrift stores for Tommy's clothes, cut his own hair to save $20, and drove a pickup truck that was older than his marriage had been. The truck's check engine light had been on for 6 months, but David couldn't afford to find out what was wrong with it. Sometimes he joked that the light was just there to keep him company during his morning commute. Tommy never complained, though. That kid was tougher than most adults David knew. When other kids at school talked about their summer vacations to Disney World or their new video game systems, Tommy would just shrug and talk about the cool rocks he'd found in the parking lot. Behind their apartment building, the boy had this thing for geology and nature shows. He'd spend hours watching documentaries about volcanoes and minerals, taking notes in a beat-up notebook like he was preparing for some important test. David felt guilty about it every single day. What kind of father couldn't even afford to take his kid to a movie? What kind of man let his 12-year-old son get excited about finding rocks in a parking lot because that was the closest thing to an adventure they could afford? The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. David was up on scaffolding, installing drywall on the 3rd floor of an office building, when his phone buzzed. He almost didn't answer it. Unknown numbers usually meant debt collectors or telemarketers, and David had learned to avoid both. But something made him pick up. "Is this David Rodriguez?" The voice was professional, crisp, a lawyer's voice. David's stomach dropped. Lawyers calling construction workers was never good news. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" "My name is Patricia Williams. I'm an estate attorney in Billings, Montana. I'm calling about your great-uncle Harold Brennan." David had to think for a moment. Uncle Harold, his grandfather's brother. The guy who'd shown up to maybe 2 family gatherings in David's entire life. Weird old man who lived somewhere out west and barely spoke to anyone in the family. David's father had always said Harold was the black sheep, the one who disappeared into the mountains and never came back to civilization. "What about him?" David asked, climbing down from the scaffolding to hear better. "I'm sorry to inform you that Harold passed away last month. Heart attack. But before his death, he updated his will. He's left you some property." David almost laughed. "Property? Uncle Harold was supposed to be some kind of hermit. What property could he possibly have had? Maybe a broken-down trailer somewhere? What kind of property are we talking about?" "It's a 47-acre parcel in rural Montana, about an hour outside of Billings. There's a cabin on the property and a lake called Willow Pond. However, there is one complication." Of course there was. David had learned that nothing in his life came without complications. The property has outstanding tax liens totaling $15,000. If these aren't paid within 60 days, the county will take possession of the land and auction it off. $15,000. David almost started laughing right there on the construction site, but it would have been the kind of laughing that leads to crying. $15,000 might as well have been $15 million. David had maybe $300 in his checking account, and that had to last until his next paycheck. So basically, this uncle I barely knew left me a property that I have to pay 15 grand for, or I lose it. That's correct, Mr. Rodriguez. I have some photographs of the property if you'd like me to email them to you. It's quite beautiful, actually. Very remote and peaceful. Beautiful and peaceful. David needed to pay rent and buy groceries, not beautiful and peaceful. But he gave the lawyer his email address anyway, mostly out of curiosity. That evening, after Tommy had finished his homework and gone to bed, David opened the email on his ancient laptop. The photo showed a small log cabin that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, surrounded by thick forest. And then there was the lake. Willow Pond was bigger than David had expected. Maybe 10 or 12 acres of dark water surrounded by pine trees and mountains in the distance. The photos made it look mysterious, almost magical, like something from a movie about people who go off the grid and find themselves. David stared at the pictures for a long time. Part of him could imagine living there with Tommy. No more sirens and traffic noise. No more worrying about whether the neighbors upstairs were going to have another loud party on a school night. Just peace and quiet and clean air that might actually be good for Tommy's asthma. But that was just dreaming. David was a practical man, and the math was simple. He didn't have $15,000. He couldn't get a loan for $15,000, not with his credit score and debt-to-income ratio. And even if he somehow managed to pay the taxes, what would he do with a remote property in Montana? He was a construction worker in Ohio. His job was here. Tommy's school was here. Their life, such as it was here. David called his best friend Mike the next day and told him about the inheritance. "Dude, that's awesome," Mike said. "You're like a landowner now." "I'm a landowner who can't afford to own land," David replied. "It's like someone gave me a Ferrari that I have to pay 15 grand to take possession of, except I can't afford the insurance, can't afford the gas, and have nowhere to park it. But it's got a lake, man. You could sell it to some rich guy who wants a vacation home." David had thought about that. But the lawyer had mentioned how remote the property was. No electricity, no phone service, accessible only by a dirt road that was apparently pretty rough. Who wanted to buy a vacation home that was basically camping with slightly better walls? Over the next few days, David found himself thinking about the property more than he should have. During lunch breaks at work, he'd look up information about the area on his phone. The nearest town had maybe 500 people. The closest grocery store was 30 miles away. It was the kind of place where you could probably see more stars at night than David had ever seen in his life. Tommy noticed his dad was distracted. One evening, while they were eating spaghetti with jar sauce for the third time that week, Tommy asked, "Dad, are you okay? You seem worried about something?" David looked at his son, this kid who never complained about anything, who got excited about rocks and parking lots and made the best of everything life threw at him. Maybe Tommy deserved to know about Uncle Harold's gift, even if it was a gift they couldn't accept. "Remember Great Uncle Harold?" "Your great-great-uncle, actually." Tommy nodded. He had a good memory for family stuff, even relatives they barely knew. "Well, he passed away and he left us some property in Montana. It's got a cabin and a lake." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Really? Like our own lake?" "Well, sort of. But there's a problem. We'd have to pay $15,000 in taxes to keep it, and we don't have that kind of money." David watched his son process this information. Tommy was quiet for a moment, twirling spaghetti around his fork. "Could we visit it? Just to see what it looks like?" David had been wondering the same thing. The property would probably be auctioned, off by the county eventually. Maybe they could take a road trip, see this place that Uncle Harold thought was worth leaving to them, and then come home with a good story. It would cost money they didn't really have for gas and maybe a cheap motel. But Tommy had never been on a real vacation. Maybe he deserved to see a lake with his name on the deed, even if it was only temporary. Maybe, David said. Let me think about it. But he was already thinking about it. Already imagining Tommy's face when he saw that lake for the first time. Already wondering what Uncle Harold had seen in that remote piece of Montana that made him think of a great nephew he barely knew. The property might be a burden David couldn't afford. But maybe, just maybe, it could also be the adventure Tommy deserved.